start just by saying thank you for having us give a talk here on the things that we have been working on. So I appreciate you giving us the space to do this. And also thanks for everyone that's showing up. I know it's hard to be motivated these days, so thanks for being here. All right. Let's see. All right. Can everyone see my screen? Great. Okay, so yeah, my name is Dana Geffner, and I'm a master's in public affairs student at the Goldman School in public policies, and I have been working in the fair trade movement for about 20 years now. And I am still working full-time as the executive director of Fair World Project, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to first go through how I got involved in the fair trade movement, and then what I'm doing, and some specifics about fair trade. And I want to start off by saying that fair trade is super complex, and I still have a hard time sometimes talking about it and explaining it because there are so many different pieces about the fair trade movement. So this is really going to just be a brief introduction to fair trade, and if anybody wants to talk more, please feel free to reach out to me. So the way I got into the fair trade movement was not in a traditional way or through education, like formal education at all. I just really loved to travel. It's all I really cared about in life. But I didn't really want to travel to go to museums or like go to beaches. I really just wanted to connect with people, to listen, to understand how we were similar and how we were different, and to really honor those differences and grow from those differences. So I started traveling through Latin America, and this is a picture of me trying to learn how to backstrap weave in Guatemala, which I cannot do because it's very difficult to do. And so this is a traditional technique that is done by Mayan indigenous women, and it's actually done all over the world, but I learned about it in southern Mexico and throughout Guatemala. And so I started traveling in Latin America, and I started learning about international policies and how these international policies were impacting these communities that I was starting to fall in love with and was feeling really close with. And I started learning about the Zapatistas in Chiapas, Mexico, and how they picked up arms for 12 bloody days before NAFTA was signed, the North American Free Trade Agreements were signed into law, because they said it was going to be death to the campaneros, the campesinos, the farmers in Mexico. And what happened there was over 2 million farmers did lose their land as a direct result of NAFTA. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that a little bit later. And then I started learning about the Sandinista Revolution and how Ronald Reagan and his administration had backed the Contras to oust the Sandinistas, who was the democratically elected government by the people. And what was happening was the cotton farmers and the coffee farmers were calling on people from the global north to come down and harvest their crops with them, and really so that they felt protected. And that was really the first time I started learning about leveraging privilege in solidarity. And so I came back home, and I was super inspired by a lot of the people that I had met along the way. This is my friend Rosa. She's a Nicaraguan woman, and I like to talk about Rosa because she was really important to me in my life and has been. She is a Sandinista. She would tell me stories about walking for 6 hours a day to fight alongside the Sandinistas, because she believed her vote counted, and she really believed in what she really believed in the Sandinista party, and her father ended up never talking to her again because of this. And it's interesting because she came and stayed with me here in the US when Reagan actually passed away, and she had to watch the media talk about Reagan and celebrating his life, and she would just sit on my couch and cry because of what they had done to her country. And then I started learning about Mayan indigenous women, meeting Mayan indigenous women in Guatemala that had took to the streets to try to stop the Monsanto law, because they said that it was not going to be able to let them to save their own seeds. And they did end up stopping this law in 2014. So these were the people that really inspired me. And it was all about organizing for me and social movements. And so I came back home. It took me 10 years to finish my undergraduate degree, and then I went traveling. Like, I just was not really a student back then at all. I really needed hands-on experience. So I got a lot of experience learning, and I started working with all these, meeting all these women that were working in handicraft cooperatives. So I started buying stuff from I had to make a salary. I had to pay some bills. So I bought handicrafts, came back home, and organized people into their own homes. And I started, I think, with my mom and 2 friends, and they organized all their friends, and we'd have like 30 or 40 people and people in their living rooms. And I would sit and sell these handicrafts, but I would make people sit and listen to me for like 45 minutes to an hour about talking about all these international policies behind like this beautiful scarf that people were making. And so that's really how and then from there, I started working with Global Exchange, which is a human rights organization, which still exists on some level today. But at that time, they had 5 different fair trade retail stores around the country. And so I started working. I had connected with so many different producer groups that I started helping them put stuff into their stores. And then from there, I started learning about corporate consolidation and what that was doing to food sovereignty in communities around the world. And talking to farmers, I was starting to learn about climate change and the impact that was happening. And I would hear the same thing from farmers, no matter where I was, whether I was in Ghana, Guatemala, or India. They would all say the same thing. If they didn't know when the rains were coming, if they came fast and hard, or they just simply wouldn't come at all. So then a group of us came, because of all of learning all this and people that I was meeting, a group of us started this organization called Fair World Project, and that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years. And so that's sort of the backdrop of how I got involved. But I want to talk a little bit about Fair World Project and what we do. I'm going to try to do this briefly. So we are a 501c3 organization advocating fair trade for small-scale farmers and labor justice for workers globally, and that's sort of my elevator pitch. And we do this in a lot of different ways, but we had started out with a magazine that we printed that told the stories from activists and farmers and farm workers and academics. And this magazine we printed 10 years ago was our first issue, and we printed 50,000 copies and immediately went to reprint for another 150,000 copies. And it was distributed in all of the different Whole Foods and co-op grocery stores and fair trade stores and church congregations. And we did 2 a year, and it was a free magazine, no advertising. And so we did that for 10 years. We just finished our 20th issue, and we decided to not do it any longer for a number of reasons. One, we had no idea, we couldn't track how many people were actually reading it because of how it was distributed at retail stores. And then when COVID hit, we knew that it was kind of the final thing. People weren't going to pick these magazines up and sit and read them where people ate in retail store and grocery stores. So our last issue is the one in orange, so we're not doing that anymore. But all year we have been working on producing a podcast, and that's going to come out towards the end of the year. If anyone's interested in that podcast, you can send me an email, or I put our communication coordinator on there if you're interested in learning about the release. We have lots of consumer and retailer tools on our website to help people make informed decisions. We do reports with academics and other NGOs around the world. We do our own reports, and then we do lots of campaigning around corporate campaigning and also watchdogging certifications. And we collaborate with lots of different organizations around the world. And we're also working on the Real Meals campaign, which we were co-founders of, to help stop these exclusive contracts that are unfair, that are happening at institutions and institutions like universities and hospitals. And you can find out more information about the Real Meals campaign as well. And then we're also working on child labor and cocoa farming. There was a huge report that just came out that was the US government funded. The University of Chicago, which found that corporations are driving poverty and that child labor is on the rise, even though all these large corporations like the Nestle's and the Hershey's said that they were going to stop that and they were going to work towards ending child labor and cocoa farming. But this report just came out and said that 1.56 million children are farming in cocoa, which is up, and that it's becoming even more dangerous today because of the push by these companies to increase their productivity, which is increasing the amount of hazardous agrochemicals that they're using. And so we're really seeing that these third-party certifications that are not addressing child labor for a number of reasons, which I'm not really going to go into, but happy to talk about at a different time. and that we really need government regulations on human rights, due diligence, and living incomes. So this coalition is working on corporations to do a number of things. Okay, so I wanted to talk about the history and the backdrop for fair trade. I think I'm good on time still. So fair trade, the backdrop of fair trade is really against neoliberal policies. And I put this really great quote by Wendy Brown here, which I'm not going to read out, but I really highly recommend anyone listening to this podcast, the DIG podcast. And she was just on, she's a professor at UC Berkeley, and she really talks about how these neoliberal policies are impacting us today. And I really appreciate all the readings that we get to do in this class that really touches on this and really ties it all together. So this is just a little bit more information for people if they're interested. So fair trade really did start as a solidarity and political resistance movement. A lot of people in the US like to tie it back to the 1940s as a development aid for refugees after World War II. But those of us that come out of more of an activist mindset and political resistant movement we really tie it back to the 1960s from radical student groups in Europe, where they really saw producers in the global South they saw solidarity with producers in the global South and really seeing fair trade as a solution to those colonial powers. Sorry if I'm stumbling a little bit. I had a really early talk this morning, so I'm a little bit tired here, so I apologize. And so I just want to talk a little bit about the North American Free Trade Agreement. This is when in the United States, people really started thinking about fair trade a little bit more. This was an agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States that was signed into law by Clinton in 1994. One of the provisions in that agreement said that companies could sue governments for protecting their citizens and the environment if there's a perceived loss of profits. And that was called the Investor State Dispute Settlement. And that actually has happened. There has been companies that have sued governments for trying to protect their citizens and the environment. And what happened with NAFTA was our corn, I use corn as a really great example, but there's other things that happened as part of NAFTA, but our corn farmers are really heavily subsidized. And so corn farmers needed to find other markets. And so there was this agreement that happened, and all of this cheap corn got dumped onto the Mexican economy for 30% less than Mexican farmers could grow their own corn. So it just decimated Mexican farmers. And so over 2 million farmers lost their land. And then the fair trade movement really starts to gain recognition even more so. This is sort of when I came into the movement during the World Trade Organization protests in Seattle in 1999. And this was a protest really against these World Trade Organization regulations and the international banking systems that we've learned about in this class. And activists and academics started speaking out and really talking about these WTO rules that were written for these large corporations that were unfair, and that fair trade was a mirror image of what those rules were. And then in Cancun, it became even more popular. Fair trade started becoming more popular here in the US after WTO protests in Cancun in 2003. And that was when a South Korean farmer and activist took his own life, committed suicide to protest against those neoliberal policies. And I just want to say that these neoliberal policies are continuing today. The new North American Free Trade Agreement that was renegotiated with by the Trump administration, which was, we call it NAFTA 2.0. This has not really changed much. It continues to put agrochemicals ahead of small-scale farmers. There's no mention of climate change, and that investment state dispute settlement that I talked about before was taken out mostly except for oil and gas companies operating in Mexico, which means that Exxon and Chevron can still sue. And then it's also opening up Canadian dairy markets for US dairy farmers, which people are concerned the same thing's going to happen in Mexico, that happened in Mexico will happen in Canada. And the new name of it is called the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. And then there's another free trade agreement that's being negotiated right now between Kenya and the US, which is super important to talk about. So Kenya, I just want to get to my notes on this because I don't want to This is a really new agreement. So Kenya is one of Africa's largest economies, and Kenya's neighboring countries buy 80% of Kenya's wheat imports. So this agreement between the US and Kenya are negotiated. If it's negotiated, it will prohibit Kenya's government to implementing pricing safeguards for basic grains. And this is what we saw with NAFTA, which was what I was talking about with corn. And so these wheat subsidies to US farmers is going to allow our US farmers here in the US to produce their wheat for 29% cheaper than Kenyan farmers can produce their wheat. So it's going to potentially open up a huge market for US farmers, but decimating farmers in Kenya at the same time. So we're keeping a close track of this and working with policy advocates to try to stop this from going forward. Okay, how much time do I have, Yael? Do you know?
I think you can go 10 more minutes.
Okay, great. Okay, so I do want to talk a little bit about the fair trade movement because a lot of people do think that they understand it, but it is super complex. So just laying the groundwork, it is a global solidarity movement. It's a political movement. There are standards and certifications, so therefore it's a market-based initiative, and it's also government regulation. So it is regulated in France. And the movement was started by and for small-scale farmers that were organizing, or producers that were organizing. They're really at the heart of fair trade, and they needed to organize to compete in a global marketplace because these large farms and large multinational corporations had all these trade agreements that were written for them. They had access to capital and markets. So small-scale farmers organizing together was really important so that they could take advantage of economies of scale, build infrastructure, build processing facilities so that they could capture value in their supply chains, access credit, and then advocate for policies and services at the local, state, and national level, which for me was always, it's all super important, obviously, but this piece was all I was always really intrigued with because I had this sort of policy mindset. And how important these secondary co-ops are, which is, so this is how a co-op, mostly in Latin America, fair trade co-ops are organized. So there's a secondary co-op, and then there's all these smaller co-ops that are made up of individual members make a co-op, and then all these smaller co-ops make the secondary co-op. And the secondary co-op is the ones that are working for all of these policies that they want to advocate for on behalf of the small-scale farmers. So briefly about fair trade certification, which I'm not going to, this is such a complex topic, but I'm just going to touch on it briefly. So the first fair trade certification was this certification that has this blue and green symbol on here. And that started in 1988 in Europe. But in the US, the Institute for Agricultural and Trade Policy helped to start that certification here. And then they also started Peace Coffee, which is a coffee company in Minneapolis. And they wanted to start that to prove that they could actually trade, they could do business in this way that was putting organized small-scale farmers at the forefront. And it's important to understand that fair trade, 2 words, is a movement, is what when we talk about the movement. And then fair trade, 1 word, is this certification's brand identity. Now there is a certification in the US called Fair Trade USA, and I'm not going to talk that much. I'm going to talk a little bit about them. They are the most popular certification that you'll see on the shelves today. And they're seriously problematic. I would call them another neoliberal program, to be perfectly honest. We have a lot of information on our website about this certification. Now, this is the landscape today of fair trade certifications, which becomes very complicated, and I'm not going to go into this. Hopefully, you can have access to these slides. But as you can see, this number 6 one that's down at the bottom, most people do not, in the movement, people do not see it as credible. However, you will see that the most on the shelves because it is very easy to reach that certification. And so on our website, we have all this information, and we have tools, kits that you can download and you can read up more about. So there's a lot of movement controversy, and that's why I needed to lay the groundwork a little bit on certification, because this is where I have to sort of tie it back to the things that are going on. So that first certification, Fair Trade International, started to certify large-scale plantations in 1994. But what they did was they said that they were only going to certify crops that were not traditionally grown by small-scale farmers, so that they wouldn't compete against those small-scale farmers. And they also worked with labor rights and trade unions to develop those standards. But they really did that because there were large multinational corporations that wanted to participate in the movement. So the Doles and Twinings, those are big corporations. So they got into the movement, and that's really where a lot of controversy started. And then we saw Fair Trade USA, which I talked a little bit about. They, in 2011, decided this is where it gets super complicated. They were part of this main certification, and they ended up leaving that certification to create their own certification so that they could certify anything on large-scale plantations and really undermine small-scale farmers. And so that's where we see ourselves today. And I like to remember that we had an organized labor movement since the Industrial Revolution that worked on collective bargaining rights and fought for safe working conditions, and that was building political power to work for workers' rights, which is just so important. And we're seeing such a huge growing inequality because our organized labor is weakening so much. And you can really, if people have not taken Robert Reich's class, I highly recommend it. He goes through really a lot of these reasons why these growing inequalities are happening in the United States. So we have to remember that certification fees, while union dues go to building political power for workers, these certification fees go to building administrative offices to deal with those certifications. So the problem with this certification is it has no representation in their governance. And I couldn't dig too deep into this because I just didn't have enough time. But a lot of us really see them as undermining worker organizations and the labor movement as a whole. They lack strong enforcements. And so they are not working on any kind of, they don't work on trade policy. They don't work on building any kind of political power. They say it's not, that's not the business that they're in. And that is what they've told us. Okay, so I wanted to, I thought that I would kind of ask a question. I want to lay the groundwork a little bit around this because Nestle is an important topic right now in the fair trade movement. There's a lot of controversy around bringing these big brands that are really, like all the things that we've been reading about in this class tie into this. Like they're fighting against, like they are for all these neoliberal policies, for these trade agreements that are protecting them, but at the same time, they're kind of saying that they want to help end global poverty. So there's so many problems with this, but I can use Starbucks as an example. Starbucks said that they would sell 10% fair trade coffee at one point. They're down to 1% right now, but that's besides the point. 10% fair trade coffee, and that 10% would be more than all the small coffee roasters in the United States. So that 10% has the potential of impacting so many small-scale farmers and more than all these small coffee roasters in the United States. So there's that. So I want to just lay out a few things, and then maybe in the chat you can all answer this question for me, and I can hear what you think about it. So there's that idea. Then there's also this idea that because of the power dynamics and the certifications make their income by how many organizations they sell. I mean, how many organizations they certify. So they actually, some of these certifications actually make money on each time that certification is actually used on a bag of coffee, for example. So that power dynamic and that conflict of interest for certifications is seriously problematic. And what we've seen is standards have weakened over the years because of this. The other thing that I like to, that concerns me is that there's all these committed brands that are, everything that they're doing is fair trade, or they're protecting their workers, or paying higher wages to their workers, even here in the United States. And what happens is a Nestle could actually sell their chocolate bar for a lot less than these other brands that are doing everything that they can, because Nestle has so much more money from all these exploitative things. So I'm just curious what people think. Should these brands with really bad exploitative practices be able to use the fair trade certification? And it's complex. I understand that. Can anybody Maybe say anything in the chat, yes or no. Maybe depends on their impact. I'm not going to answer this question because I do think it's very, very complex. Okay, I'm okay with people not wanting to respond, so I'm going to keep going. But I appreciate those that did. So real briefly, Nestle has, because of activists in the UK pushing Nestle to be in the fair trade movement, they actually did get the Kit Kat bar certified about over 10 years ago, and just recently decided to drop out of the fair trade movement. And this is sort of a trend that we're seeing in the fair trade movement. These big brands, they get certified because they've been pressured by activists to do this, and it cleans up their bad records, which Nestle has some of the worst historical exploitative record of any brand. And then they drop the certification. And we're seeing that what we're hearing is that this decision is going to impact 16,000 cocoa farmers in West Africa and 16,000 sugar farmers in Fiji. And it's really this trend of race to the bottom of ethical labeling. So we have joined a coalition that we sent over 300,000 signatures to Nestle, and it didn't stop them. They're still doing it, unfortunately. How much more time do I have? I don't know if I want to get into this part.
I think we're running out.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to skip down. I think I'll stop there. I think I'm going to stop there and let Hannah speak.
Okay.
Can I not share mine? Stop my video? Why is mine?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I got it. Okay, there we go. Thanks everyone for listening. I know that was a lot of information.
Thanks, Dana, and thanks for sharing those thought-provoking questions. And I'll pass to Hannah.
Could you share the screen?
Yeah, let me. And feel free, everyone, to put question in the chat, and Dana can answer them in the chat, but at the end of Hannah's talk, we'll have a Q&A, a live Q&A as well.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
I'm Hannah, MA student of Global Study. Yeah, basically, yeah, I work in Ministry of Foreign Affairs in South Korea, but now I'm at the Berkeley for the training. So, but yeah, I don't have any experience working at international development, but I'm hugely interested because I'm living in extreme poverty when I was young. So I want to do something to improve this situation. So I'm really fascinating about aid program, and the South Korea did it through this aid program. So that's why I choose this subject. So first, the ultimate goal of development assistance is to ensure developed countries don't need it. The development cooperation activities are carried out with various high-level objectives, but the objective of the most donors have adopted is poverty reductions. They believe solving poverty means strengthening human economy, social, culture, political, and productive capability in a multidimensional manner, where factors of environment and gender are also considered. So even though the history of development assistance is said to be from imperial era, but the current concept of aid program was organized after Second World War. The major act of foreign aid arrived with the Marshall Plan in 1947. The United States funded over $13 billion to assist in the reconstruction of Europe. This plan also led to development United Nations, IMF, and World Bank. In the 1950s, the development aid suffered from ideological confrontation due to the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. So the main focus of aid was community development, and the typical types of aid were formulated as project type aid and food aid. In the 1960s, the establishment of bilateral aid agency boomed in the countries of global north. They found their roles in providing technical assistance and budget support with a focus on productive sectors and infrastructure, while multilateral agencies like the United Nations and World Bank have supported the large-scale project type aid. However, in the 1970s, the main focus shifted to agriculture development, and the basic human need is reflecting on ideological shift in the aid community from economy development to poverty reduction. So due to economy setback followed the recession in the 1970s, the market-based reform have been heavily dominated in donors. The World Bank quickly shifted from its project-based aid to the structural adjustment program. This wave also stimulates the rise of non-governmental organizations, and this trend was continued until the 1990s. However, in 1997, as the Asian economic crisis occurred, the effectiveness of aid was questioned again. Aid agency admit simple reliance on market mechanism was the panacea, and a good mixture of transparent market and efficient governance should be pursued. So the basic approach of aid shifted from independent projects to sector-wide programs. Now, the World Bank established to set up millennium goals to end poverty, with the most recent deadline in 2030. The resources given and countries involved are the greatest in the history of foreign aid. So looking at this graph, we can find the amount of aid from members of OECD Development Assistance Committee from 1960 to 2017 has been on a steady rise, but the ODA target ratio of 0.7% of the gross national income has been met. In addition, since 1996, donors tend to give the great weight to aid in the social sector, such as education and water and the house problem. And the ratio is continue to rise. So does aid really help to reduce global poverty? So I really consider hard, but yeah, my initial answer is yes. As of 2050, the extreme poverty rate living on below $1.90 a day declined to 10%, the lowest level in recorded history. Over the last 3 decades, more than 1 billion people lived themselves out of extreme poverty, and about half of the country in the world that reduce extreme poverty to below 3%. So aid has definitely contributed to reduce poverty, but I think it's not enough. Unlike other regions, the total number of extremely poor people in sub-Saharan Africa is increasing despite much more aid being provided to this region than to other regions. While the available poverty rate for other regions was below 30% as of 2050, but yeah, it stood at about 41%. According to Poverty and Shared Prosperity 2018, the factor behind the higher levels of poverty in Africa included the slow growth rate and the problems caused by conflict and weak institutions and lack of the success in channeling growth into poverty reduction. At this point, how should we approach development aid to reduce poverty in Africa? To find the answer, I would like to talk about South Korea as the most successful case of development assistance. So yeah, before discussing South Korea's aid programs, we should know its historical background. Basically, South Korea has no significant natural resource, and it's devastated by Japanese colonial rule for 36 years and the Korean War in 1950. After the war, South Korea was one of the poorest country in the world, in only $67 per capita income, and the government rely on foreign aid for all of national budget. At that time, the U.S., the Agency for International Development, called South Korea a bottomless pit. But as you know, the South Korea's fortune have increased spectacularly. Now it became the 12th largest country in terms of GDP as of last year, and the first developing country member of the OECD Development Assistance Committee in 2010. In the course of South Korea's social and economic development from 1945 to 1999, the total official foreign assistance amounted to about $42 billion in current prices. This amount includes public development grants of about $7 billion and loans of about $35 billion. Assistance provided to Korea under 1945 to 59 was primarily the emergency humanitarian relief. So most grants are allocated to the foodstuffs and emergency consumption goods. But the 1960, under the strong leadership of dictator Park Chung-hee, marked the turning point in the history of official foreign assistance in South Korea. The scale of aid increased compared with the previous decade, and the objective of aid shifted from reconstruction to economic growth through industrialization and export. Throughout this development decade, the public grants account for only 1.8% of total capital inflows. Indeed, public development loans rather than public grants play the role of Korea's high growth and successful industrialization. And basically, South Korea has no restraints on where to use the aid it received due to political reason. So government focus on building up large economy champions against the United States advice to focus on small and medium-sized companies. That policy reflected the actual sectoral application of the loans. The government prioritized the economy infrastructure sector, followed by the production sectors. It laid the foundation for successful South Korean brands in the world market, such as Samsung, LG, and Hyundai. However, the social infrastructure sector was allocated about only 12%. Such a sectoral allocation was quite different from that of the DAC members' official the development assistance clause, which place much greater emphasis on the social and administrative infrastructure. So what lessons we can learn from the case of South Korea? First, provision of consumption goods are effective in temporarily getting out the starvation of South Korea, but it didn't stimulate growth. The foreign assistance will be more effective if the emergency relief ends earlier, and the aid fund should be provided for investment. Second, the sectoral application of aid that seems to have been more important than the absolute level of aid. Among 60 countries were at a similar level of the per capita incomes as South Korea during the 1960s, South Korea received the least amount of ODA as a ratio of GDP. South Korea applied their aid to the economy, infrastructure, and production sectors on a priority base, and it led to stimulate investment and growth. Of course, yeah, it's understandable. Yeah, donors are reluctant to provide aid in the economy sector, considering there were some cases the government of the recipient countries didn't properly allocate the aid they receive in the name of economic growth, and they use it to fill their own interests. But unless their economy infrastructure improve and their economy independence increase, there will be no long-term poverty reduction as shown in South Korea's case. Third, with the will of leaders of recipient countries to improve their poverty, an organization that evaluates whether aid is used properly is essential, not only in donors, but also in recipients. South Korea established a special interministerial committee to efficiently distribute loans and evaluate the implementation of their plans. This system contributes to a careful and non-political selection of the investment projects and programs. Yeah, donors have tried to reduce global poverty by providing aid focus on focus on the social sector over the past 3 decades, but the results haven't been so great in Africa, as you know. The most worry about thing is the World Bank predict poverty in adolescents will continue to decline, but yeah, poverty in sub-Saharan Africa won't improve by 2030. So what we should note at this point is the improvement of poverty in adolescents is all related to the economic growth of countries in rich regions like China, Brazil, and India. So yeah, finally, yeah, it can be explained fully. The South Korea's growth is due to aid, but it was impossible to build an industrial foundation without aid. So I think it's time to approach this issue from a different perspective before poverty in the global South to become more serious. So my conclusion, so on the direction of development assistance policies, that the donors should increase the proportion of aid in the economy sector, and the leaders of the global South should have the will to improve their situation and make plans, make proper plans for it. That is, we should encourage countries to build their own economy foundation through aid, and then the trade along with support and civilians. So thank you for listening to my presentation. And is there any question for Dana and me about the presentation?